In Gaza, where at least 9 people, including a child, are now believed to have been killed after Israeli forces fired live ammunition at protesters. The Palestinian Health Ministry says 580 more have been injured, 41 children among them. The shootings took place as Palestinians resumed their protest against the Israeli occupation. During the demonstrations, a spokesperson for the Israeli army tweeted a warning that no one can hide from their snipers, including in the tweet an image of a child, actually multiple children, in a gun scope. Our correspondents Hind Khoudary and Paula Slier have been reporting from both sides of the Gaza border.
We are now 100 meters away from the fence that separates Gaza Strip and Israel. Palestinian youth have been burning tires since the morning near the fence to blur the vision of the snipers, Israeli snipers, to shoot or target any Palestinians. The Israelis have been using wastewater to disperse the protesters. Palestinians are still coming, they're still marching, and hundreds of Palestinians have been here since the morning. And we saw Palestinian protesters burning US flags and Israeli flags, and also saying slogans against the Israelis and the Americans since the morning. Tension is running high right now, and Palestinians are still in the field and still near the fence.
I'm standing here on the Israeli side of the Israel-Gaza border, where these plumes of smoke are slowly making their way from Gaza into Israel. Now, there's a lot of tear gas that's being fired into Gaza. We can hear the sound of tear gas canisters from here. We can also hear the sounds of bullets. Of course, the Israelis are being accused by the international community of using live fire on unarmed protesters. But the Israelis, for their side, say that among these protesters are hundreds of militants who are aiming at them with Molotov cocktails and the like. I'm standing in a closed military zone. The Israelis have brought in reinforcements. There are tanks on the border. We're not allowed to go closer to the border than where I'm actually standing. The Israeli snipers are also aware that the Palestinians are using pieces of mirrors to try and block their vision and make it more difficult for them. We're also being told that should the situation on the other side of the border get too unruly, the Israelis plan on using sewage water to deal with the people there. So the situation here on the border extremely tense, and unfortunately the number of casualties expected to climb, if not in the coming hours, then certainly in the coming days.
Both Paula and Hind join me now live. Let's go to you first, Hind. As usual, the Israeli army says today's protests were riots infiltrated by terrorists and claim the demonstrations are all, quote, part of Hamas's plan. As someone on the ground, what is your reaction to that?
Well, today was the second mass demonstration for the Great March of Return. And as usual, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were protesting. And actually, Palestinians were unarmed. Palestinians were trying to block the vision of the Israelis by using mirrors and burning the tires. And I would like to say that the Palestinians today had the ability to defeat the dozens of snipers that were on the Israeli side, and they were burning tires to block the vision and they actually had the ability to do that. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, at least 8 Palestinians have been killed from live ammunition that were directly shot on the protesters near the fence, and more than 1,300 Palestinians have been injured from live bullets and tear gas canisters. Between these injuries are 24 women and 80 children, and 35 Palestinians are in severe cases just from today. And we saw that it was a very tough week on the fence since last Friday.
And Paula, what has been the reaction in Israeli society and media to the news of last week's Land Day massacre and the ongoing demonstrations in Gaza?
I would say there's certainly some criticism here in Israel. You certainly hear from the Israeli left accusations that the Israeli army is using excessive force. But by and large, most of the Israeli public do support their army. And this is an army that insists that they are acting in accordance with international law and the rules of engagement. What the Israeli army, and by extension the Israeli society, keep pointing out is that not everyone is unarmed in these protests. Last week, for example, there were 18 people killed. But the Israeli army says it has evidence that 11 of them were members of the armed wing of Hamas. They say that again today, Friday, the protesters were firing at them with explosive devices, Molotov cocktails and firebombs. Also, we're hearing from the Israeli defense minister that the country has the right to defend its sovereignty, and that throughout the week there have been warnings issued that anyone approaching the border fence will be shot at. So the Israeli army is saying that there were a number of cases where people approached the border fence, and as such, in protecting those Israeli communities who live around the border, they have the right to shoot at them. So certainly a lot of support here in Israel for the actions of the Israeli army.
And Paula, still, if you know, Israel says this is the case, they were firing on people approaching the border or people who were members of an armed faction. Is there a way to then have an independent or an investigation where they could make the case that this is why the violence was carried out? I mean, they seem so far to be hostile to even simply investigating the deaths.
Well, look, the official word coming from the country's defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, is that there will be no international investigation. The Israeli army always holds its own investigations, but critics then say that these investigations are not as objective as they could be. Although, to be fair, the Israeli army investigations are quite critical and do potentially show both sides of the story. Let me point out that the United Nations is calling for an international investigation. We have heard them accusing Israel of using excessive force. But again, we're hearing from the Israeli side that it will not adhere to any kind of international investigation. There's a lot of support for the rules of engagement, for the way the soldiers have been behaving. And at the same time, we're hearing from the country's defense minister that if the protests were happening deep inside Gaza, there would be no problem from the Israeli side. It's the fact that they're happening on the Israel-Gaza border, that they're aimed directly at people trying to thwart that border and infiltrate Israel and carry out, according to the Israeli side, terror attacks inside Israel, that they insist they're behaving the same way that any other country protecting its borders would elsewhere in the world.
Hind, Palestinians are not only demanding the right of return to their land, they're protesting the conditions they're forced to live under due to the Israeli-imposed siege in Gaza. Can you tell viewers what it means to live under siege and why Gazans are at the point where they're willing to put their bodies on the line like this?
Well, Gaza is a 365 square kilometer open-air jail prison for 2 million people. We only have 4 hours of electricity daily. We have zero freedom of movement. Rafah border doesn't open only for 1 or 2 days every month. Nobody can travel or have access of movement through areas crossing the borders that the Israelis control. Here, unemployment rates, food insecurity, poverty rates are rising, and this is an indicator that shows that Gaza is on the verge of collapsing. Palestinians have been living under 11 years of blockade imposed by Israel. The situation in Gaza Strip has been very bad in the past months, and especially after Donald Trump's declaration in cutting fund of the UNRWA and moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
We're unfortunately out of time. Hind Khoudary, Paula Slier, thank you so much for making time for us this evening.